IVM.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
This is Audiogyan, and I am your host, Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world. Today we have Fernando Velho with us on Audiogyan. He's a Goa-based architect, researcher, and visiting professor of urban design at the Goa College of Architecture. He's a part of Goa Collective, a group of professionals working towards better urban spaces and public life in Goa. They're drawing, or should I say they're redrawing maps. And today we are here to discuss more about it, what's Goa Collective and all about maps, primarily from a philosophical perspective, but also literal. So let's see how it unfolds. Welcome, Fernando, to Audiogyan. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Kedar, for having me on your podcast. I really look forward to chatting with you.
Great. So thanks for giving your time. And I've come up with sort of 10 questions. Again, briefly touching upon Goa Collective and also what are maps, how are they designed. I don't know how many I have not heard any sort of podcast in the Indian space where we are specifically talking about maps in general. And obviously, I'm not expecting any cartographical or more technical kind of stuff, but generally philosophical. So I wanted to start off by asking what according to you are maps? We'll start from the base. How do you perceive them? What is your understanding? What made you sort of interest in maps, and how has the journey been so far?
Okay, so let's talk about maps very broadly. Maps are representations by which human beings navigate the world. We understand the world through maps. And these are some of the oldest non-verbal means of representations that exist in the world. Okay, and there are specific qualities that go into making a map. There is an element of measurement and there's an element of spatiality. Okay, so if you do not have the quantity of measurement in your map, it becomes a painting. If it's only measurement, it becomes a graph. So you have to have this play of measurement as well as spatiality, and that's what makes a map. And this is the way we navigate the world. Some of the oldest maps, dangerously close to being paintings, but they could qualify as being maps. These are the maps that existed in the cave paintings, say in Bimbetka in France. Maps are one of the earliest forms of non-verbal communication that exists in the world. They are means by which human beings make sense of the world. And it is through maps that we navigate and understand the world around us. Maps have two specific qualities that are required to call it a map. One is the element of measurement, and one is the representation of spatiality. So if a map does not have an element of measurement in it, it is a painting. Or if it has only measurement, it becomes a graph. So it is this interplay between representation of spatiality is what goes into making a map. And
isn't measurement sort of also establishing the spatiality?
Yeah, it is an interplay of both. So you need to have the data and verifiable data in order to represent it. So there is both. As I said, it's an interplay, and there's no right formula to this. It is what one is trying to say by making a map, and what is one trying to get at by making a map. That determines what is the data one would require, and what is the type of representation one would choose to make a map.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So scale is a type of measurement. Like when you say interplay between, technically sort of the scale and the directions and all those things fall in that sort of bucket.
Yeah. So scale is one of the earliest forms of quantifying the world, because some of the earliest maps made by Cro-Magnons were when they entered the caves. And then they began drawing animals in relation to each other. So there was an element of scale. They drew the animals they hunted and they compared them. They also compared their migration patterns, etc. So there was an element of scale. And it's one of the most basic forms of measurement that generally could be done visually also. So scale and maps is one of the most fundamental conditions of mapping, I would say.
Oh, beautiful. Actually, I'm sort of because a designer, I'm sort of visualizing. So I wanted to go deeper into this question that when you said animals, what are different types of maps? Because when you typically say map, we like India or world and then 5 continents, and that's what you see, right? In the artist side of space, I've seen different people doing different sorts of map also, sometimes just showing vegetation or sometimes showing, say, just the elevation or the railway map. And now these days, there's some Instagram handle which I forgot, but just where all I have been in the world, you can just pin them on the maps, or best surfing beaches of the map. So yeah, if is there any definition or anybody can make a map, or we can start there, that what are different types of maps and then how does one explore it?
Yeah. So I would say there are broadly 8 categories of maps that exist in the world today. There would be political maps. That's the easiest to understand. And and political maps are maps by which humans are willing to shed blood over. You just look at Russia and Ukraine. I mean, these are the most contested maps and people are willing to die over those boundaries. Okay, so political maps is, everyone understands what a political map is. But there are also other categories. There are physical maps, there are topographical maps, climate maps, road and navigational maps would be one category. Then economic maps, thematic maps, and cadastral maps. So each of them are separate categories, but one could also use them in various permutations and combinations. You could have a road map, which is also a navigational map, but it could also be tied into, say, the topographic map of the region. So how much fuel you're going to expend. And that would make it a thematic map, because you're navigating with the map, but you're also knowing how much fuel you're burning by the elevation you're moving through. You're going from, say, Goa to Nepal versus, say, going from New York to California. You are navigating various physical parameters, but you're quantifying data while you're making these maps.
Sure. Got it. So, then maybe we can double click on the political one. Why do we need maps?
So fundamentally, we need, as human beings, as I said, we're here for a finite amount of time, and we're born and we have to make sense of this very complex world we live in. So maps have become the default tools by which we then begin unpacking the world around us. Okay, so these are very political tools. And the way we understand the world has a long history to it. So every generation of human beings adds a layer of mapping that helps the next generation to navigate this complex world around us. So let's start with the earliest map makers. The world's first map maker, they say, existed in Greece, was Anaximander. And as Anaximander created a world map, for him, the world was round with Europe on top. And Europe was the place where human beings existed, because that's the way he saw the world. Wow. But he was immediately challenged by his student, and his students, Anaximenes, said, no way. The world is not round. The world is flat. It's rectangular. And so the world's first maker was immediately challenged by his own student. So maps are highly contested. It is because what we're doing is we're taking very complex data and we're using human bias in order to filter through that data. So map making is highly contested, and there's no right and wrong. It's just perspective that we bring to the data that makes this terrain so complex. And it is also something we're willing to shed blood over. Okay, so where we draw boundaries political boundaries don't exist on the terrain. These are some things that exist in maps. But if someone crosses a political boundary, you're asking for trouble. And I'm not talking about national boundaries also. I'm just talking about all manner of social constructs. I'm talking about caste, religion. And you're seeing this happening in India at the moment, where you're seeing very, very deeply held beliefs of where boundaries exist and what can be transgressed being enforced on the ground. So as a democratic society, map making has become ever more important. And it is very important for civil society and for the government to, in a democratic society or in a society that aims to be democratic, is to make data available to the citizens. And by which then certain social conditions can be fought over and can be contested in a fair democratic manner. Okay, there are all manner of boundaries, caste boundaries, gender boundaries, language boundaries that exist in the urban sphere around us. Okay, but we have to bring this out. And this is one of the reasons why we founded the Goa Collective, is because this data is not available to us. And we have to go searching for it. And it's quite difficult to find this data. So we're making baby steps.
Yeah.
And
which sort of data is this for Goa Collective? As in, is it just the physical and the topological sort of boundaries, or much more than that?
Yeah. Okay. So we're a bunch of architects and design studios who've gotten together, and we want to bring in our skills as architects, urban designers, industrial designers to the medium, to a democratic space by which society then can visualize the societies they live in. Because if you don't have maps to reveal the patterns that influence our lives, we just think like, we are operating with pure logic and we don't question the structures around us. So this is one of the reasons map making then becomes such an important tool for us. And the most basic data is topographical data, physical data. So that's where we began, because that's also an area we understand quite well, is mapping of cities and mapping of urban environments. But to get a hold of this data is not that easy. So there are a lot of government agencies that have this data, but they will not share it with you. They will also not share it with each other. Okay, because under the guise of national security, whatever.
Oh, okay.
There's always this fear that, giving too much data to the population makes them restless and makes them demanding of the government. So best use national security to not share any sort of physical data. But this has become more and more redundant, because I don't know if you've ever noticed certain signs on dams, for instance, no photography allowed. This era of satellite photography, this is completely redundant. But these are the kind of impediments that exist in society. And in a democratic society, civil society should push back against this. And this is one thing I've realized living in two very different societies, America and Singapore. So in America, for all its faults, there's one thing one can look up to that society is the amount of data they make available to the ordinary citizen. So you want to know how African Americans are marginalized in New York City, there will be a data set by which you can get that data and refer to it and make a map from it. Now, that, when you visualize data like that and you bring it out in the public, there's an immediate demand for social justice then, right? So I was amazed, and I was like a foreigner studying there. And I was a student in the university, but I used the university to get all manner of information, which I thought would never be made available to me. And I constantly thought, like, what would Goa look like if I had all this data available to me? So then I lived in Singapore, and I also tried getting this data. And it was not available to you at all. The data you were fed was what the government gave you. Okay, and generally when the government gives you data, it's all very rosy. It's not going to challenge the status quo. So when I began teaching at the Goa College of Architecture, I also began looking at some of the work students had conducted. And I began looking at Goa, and it was disturbingly like America, because America is very divided on racial lines. And I thought Goa was a very harmonious society, which it is. It is. It is. All like I can say, it's a really nice place to live in. It has its problems, but like whatever. Living here, it's a pleasant place to live in. And when some of the students went and started mapping this data, how do the different religions live in Goa? You think they'd all be mixed and having peaceful coexistence, and it was quite shocking. It was actually very, very divided for religious lines, and including like building blocks almost exclusively like of one religion or the other. And but when I saw that data, I was like, oh my God, this is very close to the data like I saw in America. It's like the way New York is. It's like highly multicultural, but it's highly segregated also. So yeah, so it's good to get that data out in a democratic society, and this is what we're aiming to do. It's just like make people a bit uncomfortable.
Mhm.
Let's challenge the notions of what we think like Goan society is. And so we started with the simplest. We don't want to jump directly into this kind of religious sphere, and it gets highly contested. So we just started with this very simple topic which would startle everybody. It's like the river systems of Goa and how they are dying, because like no matter what your social class or religion or social standing is, you're going to be concerned looking at the way mining has ruined Goa's landscape. And you're also seeing a startling rise in cancer-related deaths in Goa. I don't know if you can put two and two together, but one of the discussions we had at the Goa Collective is this cancer rising because it's being detected early? Or is it some sort of environmental impact that is happening that is causing all this cancer? And we don't know. We don't have the answers for that. But what we are trying to look at is, why is it spreading across Goa? Is it a lifestyle thing? Are Goans doing something that is causing all this cancer? So we started looking at water, because water is what all of us like.
Common sort
yeah,
of.
it's a common, it's something we all use, and it's something provided by the government, right? And what we noticed is a lot of the mining pits are being used to supply water, like drinking water from mining pits. And old mines are very close to rivers. And there's all these problems of heavy metal leaching into the water. So this was one of the first things we wanted to study, is the effect of the physical landscape, like on Goa's society. So this is something we're exploring right now. It's just that the river systems, the water, what are we consuming? Where is this water coming from? And the government is quite open about it. Like in May, they just begin pumping all this water out from mining pits, treating it and putting it in our taps. Now, yeah, okay. So where do we go from here? Can we make a map? Do we have the data of cancer cases in Goa? We'll put it down. Give us the data. Tell us which taluka has a spike in cancer numbers, and tell us where the water is coming from. If there isn't a correlation, then fine. I mean, let's discover what is causing all this. Is it a lifestyle change? Are we more sedentary? Are we eating wrongly? I mean, all this can be mapped, right? So we got to get to the bottom of this at some point.
Yeah, I'm sort of getting, but I'm not able to visualize exactly how this gets placed or how this gets tagged and then what it goes into. But yeah, I think that will, maybe if you can touch upon in the end. But because the way I'm sort of visualizing it, it's like you walking with the GPS and just plotting something, or is it like you taking some satellite photos and then like imposing or superimposing certain sort of diagrams over the geography? I think we'll come to that in a bit. But
Sure.
Keeping the philosophical aspect, like, do you think maps sort of, like, what comes first, like the maps or the boundaries? Because when you were saying about Karnataka and Goa, typically, again, what I can visualize is that welcome to Karnataka, welcome to Belgaum, that's sort of a board, and then there is some outline. There is typically a toll when you cross states. So yeah, are these plotted first, or how do these get sort of plotted also? Are they organically growing, or someone is deciding, and then like, if you can give some insights there?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the most fascinating talks I've attended was one in Mumbai when I was an architecture student when I was a young architect working one of my first jobs, I was I was called for this small conference in which Professor Dilip Dakuna from the University of Pennsylvania was giving a talk on water. And he said, this division of land and water seems very natural to human beings. Like, we know what is land, we know what is water. But he said, it has if you look at it in a very scientific way, this division is not as clear as we make it out to be. Okay, because the world exists in a state of wetness where land, no matter how dry it is, has an element of water in it. There is vapor, etc.
There's groundwater anyways.
Yeah, there's groundwater. There's all manner of water that exists on land. But if you look at a map, you know where, whatever, the boundary of Goa starts and the Arabian Sea, like where the boundary of Goa ends and the Arabian Sea starts. That line is very sharp on the map. Okay, but we also are a state that gets 3 meters of rainfall. Okay, so in the monsoons in like 2 months. So now it's like very dry. We're in April and there's very little water on the land, but come June, there's water everywhere. So when you make a map, how do you draw these boundaries? Like, how do you take a pen and say this is land and this is water? Until today, with all the technology we have, there is no like scientific way of depicting that boundary. Okay, so there is always this element of human bias that exists on how one draws a boundary. Okay, and we are constantly like being fooled that technology, all we require is an advance of technology, and that map making in the future will be totally objective, and this element of human bias will disappear at some point, and it will never.
This is what you're saying. We are fooled. We are fooled by saying this.
Yeah, we are fooled. And the way we draw boundaries on maps is determined by a human bias. Okay, so when you say which came first, the boundary or the map, I would say is human bias came first. It's like human bias came first, and then we draw a boundary where we think, be it a political boundary or a physical boundary, the separation of land and water. And it's then so then you draw a map, you separate land and water. The next person who comes, looks at the map, says, yeah, this is where land and water are separated, and will build a band in that area and literally separate land and water based on the map. So these are very powerful tools, let's put it that way, and it influences a lot of human behavior and how we navigate the world, right?
Very fascinating. Let's take a short break here. We'll be right back.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Advertising is Dead, Piyush Gupta, president of Keystone, talks to Varun about how his experimental marketing agency is helping brands get on the metaverse. On Voices for Water, Karthik is joined by Dr. Anju Gaur, senior water resource management specialist. Together they navigate the landscape of Indian water data. On Pulyabazi, Pranay and Saurabh dig into why exactly the taxes on petrol are so high. On Ek Chuski Finance, Priyanka tells us how we can avoid taking a financial risk. And on Marathi Kirkitun, the Deshmukhs explore the beauty of the Devanagari font on the occasion of Akshaya Tritiya. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're following this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth is one of our biggest, most helpful things you can do for us. We'd really appreciate that. And also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. Go check out ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. You get a list of all of our YouTube channels there. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and the advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It's at ivmpodcast.com/survey. This really helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors for this week, SBI Life Insurance, India Water Portal, and Jupiter, a digital banking app.
Okay, welcome back to the show. I interviewed Ganesh Devi, the linguist, and I had asked him a similar question that, like, what's a standard language? Is there something called a standard language? And he gave almost a similar answer. I mean, like, the parallels are similar, where there is nothing called a standard. It's just that it's a political concept. And in fact, like what we call is like one of the other podcasts which I had heard, he's sort of the guest on that podcast put it very beautifully that a standard language is a language with a gun in a hand. So it's just like power play of sort of human beings over the other. Yeah. So like,
could I add something to that?
Please.
Yeah. So it's the same with map making. It's exactly the same with map making. Map making is a very powerful tool. It is because whenever we map something, it implies we have the data. We have the measurements of that data set in order to make a map, right? So when we are mapping something like a minoritized group or wildlife under threat, it is assumed that the map maker has the data of the subject. But frequently, when it comes to mapping other social conditions, it's only one group that has that data, that is able to map other groups. So frequently, if you see maps of, say, tribes of India, there's the government that's making these maps, or these advantaged dominant groups, social groups are making these maps. And the tribes of India are not, many of them are in social condition by which they cannot respond with maps of their own. So there is this huge political, difference of power that prevents certain groups from responding with maps, because then you can have like a proper contestation of ideas. But when one person is making the maps, has the data to make maps, it also speaks of that. Of the difference in power that these groups hold.
But can there be, I don't know, it's a tough one because Wikipedia also to a certain extent gets like fudged, right? But still, it's sort of the closest democratic sort of setup where we are trusting. So is there something that can be done in the map world also by plotting certain things and then validating with other groups and keeping it completely democratic as opposed to we drawing a line of POK or whatever, LOC and is there something like that?
Yes. And this is where professionals, any professional within the design space has a huge role to play, because many of us come from groups that have a lot of social advantage over other groups. Okay. And we are the ones who can make maps, but we can also offer skills to these groups in order to map data that is valid to them. For instance, there are many villages in Goa who are opposed to very powerful multinational groups. Okay. And these villages tend to be very kind of socially disadvantaged. But say they want to protect their water resources, etc. If this can be mapped, a professional can go and help them make a map. It becomes a very powerful tool by which they can then go and speak to the government and speak back to power, mobilize themselves. So design professionals and the design world has a huge role to play, in which we can make very basic maps specifically of groups, no matter which environment we exist. Even in Mumbai, just go outside your house, there will be a squatter settlement that would be deemed illegal. Okay, so the urban condition should not make any human being, the settlement, the housing of any human being in a city illegal. So you have to make a map, help these neighborhoods mobilize by mapping all the data that they want put out there. And it's very simple data. How many households have water? Can we get a sewerage line to every house?
And where do you get this from? Like from the local municipality, or you're actually talking to people and going around in that area?
You can do both. Because, for all the bad things we hear about our government, in which we are always grumbling about how badly the government works, there are officers with a good heart, let's put it simply, who will give you this data. And if they see that you're going towards a goal that is socially responsible, many of them go out of their way because they also want to leave a legacy behind. So it's good to speak to people. They are the ones who have the knowledge of the local terrain, but the government has the overall data and of utilities, social structure. It's all there. It's just that you need to go and fish it out.
The reason why I sort of spoke about the Wikipedia thing is because I was just reading through Mahatma Gandhi's sort of description, and I don't know what's the current status, but it is said that he's popularly known as Father of the Nation, while in school it was said he's known as Father of the Nation. So the narratives are changing subtly without even people noticing. And so what is happening here? Like, do you think like when humans are creating these sort of power structures or sort of demarcations, are they creating sort of exclusivity that this is, say, Goa and this is Maharashtra and these are Goans and these are Maharashtrians? And so, yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask, like, do they create exclusivity, or like, what are the dangers of map making also?
Yeah, so that's precisely. So in a democratic space, all ideas should be contested, like in the grand scheme of things. So exclusivity is one of the ways in which political power exerts itself in the social sphere. Okay, so it has to be challenged also. So the best way of challenging social hierarchies is to make a map from the other side, is to have two maps speak to each other. In the oldest Greek tradition, the first map that was made by Anaximander was challenged by his students. So yeah, so whenever you feel that certain boundaries are being drawn too harshly, they also have to be challenged. And map making is the best way of challenging them, of socially mobilizing and politically mobilizing people.
But even in the Greek traditions and whatever little bit I know, there were certain formats, there was certain logic, there was certain ethics, and there was certain grammar in which these arguments were also contested, or these conversations. Is there any pattern here where, or it's just sharing raw data and your representation? Because when a human is drawing it, there is a bias, right? So then how do you contest objectively?
So as I've said, maps have an inherent bias. Map making has an inherent bias to it. There can never be a map that is completely objective, that can never be challenged. That map doesn't exist. It is because you are taking very complex data sets, you're simplifying them, and you are using your intuition and your personal biases and or group biases for that matter in order to simplify this data, right? So data and contestation go hand in hand. It is because we are looking at the world with two different lenses or many different lenses.
But there would be an exception in terms of the geographical, the physical location, because I mean, like Panjim is right at a particular lat long, right? So that cannot be challenged. So apart from that, everything can be challenged, or there are other certain maps which may not be challenged because of like hard evidences.
So when we say Panjim is in a certain place in New York or somewhere else, we are following a certain set of conventions, and those conventions can be challenged. Okay, because as society moves on, there are different ways of viewing this data, and different conventions arise. So yes, the way we see the world today has been built upon by Ptolemy's maps and Mercator and Al-Biruni. We are all building up on that data, but we are also changing conventions, etc. So this idea that a map is unchanging, or Panjim is in Panjim and in a certain location and will always be here, I would say the convention probably 200 years from now would be something completely different. Because technology changes, measurements change. The way we see data is constantly evolving. So so there's lots of space of contestation.
Wow. So I don't know, for like just to be adventurous, I'm going very abstract. So if all people from Panjim move to say Delhi physically, will like Panjim be called Panjim, or will Delhi be called Panjim? I mean, finally, it's a group of people and their living style, what cultural values they carry. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it's making sense, but No,
it makes complete sense. I'll just give you a very interesting reading that I was doing. That said, in America, being the country of immigrants, everybody is curious to know where they came from. And the colonial administration in Goa kept very, very accurate records of who you were. Okay, so if I want to trace myself in Goa, I can do a pretty accurate job till the records were kept. But now there is this interesting tool of DNA analysis. Okay, so you can go, anybody in the world can go and do a DNA test. And the results are totally fascinating because, we always feel, I am from here, you are from there. But you do a DNA test and it'll show that you've moved all around the world, basically. That we started in Africa, one branch moved here, one branch moved there. And in America, that's a very big thing because a lot of African Americans do not have this data. Where in Africa did they come from? So they do this test, and it throws up sometimes results that do not always match with their known family histories. Okay, so sometimes, say, someone is seen to be from Ghana from DNA tests. Can you be 100% sure that that person came from Ghana? And scientists are saying increasingly no, you can't be so sure because groups of human beings are constantly shifting locations because we are mobilized politically and many times we are displaced politically also. So I might live in Goa, but tomorrow, like whatever, my group of people could be displaced to Delhi. Okay, but 1,000 years from now, someone does a DNA test and it shows that I've lived in Delhi. This shift might not be represented. So there's this whole fascinating, map making that's going on of human migrations between where do you think you've come from and where does scientific data validate that claim. Okay, so as I said, there's measurement and then there's representation. So politically, you could say I came from here, but scientifically, the measurement data might not totally match up.
Wow. I can see like a connect again with the Ganesh Devi's talk because even he mentioned about languages because we are personified as a mother sort of language. We think that it dies because it's personified, but it technically it doesn't die. It's killed. It's systematically killed by certain political sort of motives and stuff like that. So yeah, it's very fascinating to draw parallels of what I'm hearing from you. So how frequently are these drawn or redrawn or like, I mean,
I would say
when is the right time to redraw? Say post-independence or every day?
Right. So I would just say it really depends on the motivations for redrawing maps because there is a certain motivation when one draws a map or redraws a map for that matter. Why are you doing it? That's the question I would ask is like how often it's done. The more contested the terrain is, the more like the boundary is going to be challenged, right? Because you also see, you see this in everyday life, encroachment. Like what is encroachment? It's like you mark your piece of land. Someone says, no, I don't believe that piece of paper. This is where I think my rights lay. It's on your land. So it really depends on the contestation, depends on the motivation, depends on the political climate. Like,
this week, what happened?
Trust. Yeah, absolutely. So also map making, some of the most, the greatest advances in map making have come from the military. And the military industrial complex of today has given us whatever GPS, ArcGIS, everything has come from the military industrial complex. It is because the political boundaries are so contested that we've developed this whole industry around it to, map the earth to the last millimeter in order to, and that's why so much investment goes into map making, into militaries. You see, armies today navigate by satellites, which have measured the earth through triangulation in pretty accurate ways. And this is, has frequently happened in human history, is as we expand, as we discover the globe, as we push other people away from terrain, we put in more investments into map making.
With today's sort of data-driven world, like how can we sort of vouch the accuracy of a map? Now, again, I know because of hearing that there are so many types of maps, you can pick one which has been sort of, political is the most contested, but like just to make it relatable also, if we can sort of look at a particular type of map and then how do we sort of guarantee the accuracy of it?
Right. Okay. So we have to also know what we are challenging. Are we challenging broader conventions? As in, like, are we challenging the way these conventions look at the world? Or are we challenging measurement data? Because there might be that data available, but the way it is being represented could be questioned. Okay, so the same person could look at the same data and represent it very differently. Like, I'll give you a very simple example. If you use a dot to represent the population of Bombay versus that of Goa, how big that dot would be in relation to a certain area of Bombay?
So Bombay, I think it's about 20 million people.
Yeah, 20 million
and
people. But like
Goa would, I have no idea. Similar?
1.5 million. 1.5 million. But there are parts of Goa, like the urban centers, that are quite dense, right? But if we just use one dot to represent Goa and one dot to represent Bombay, it doesn't give you the full picture. Okay,
but
so
in different sizes, no? But in different
sizes. But a person coming to live in Goa, if he came to live in a dense part of, say, Panjim city, it's not as like open as you'd imagine it to be, right? But there could be some parts of, say, Alibag or Greater Bombay, which would be green, right? So the way the same data is represented can be challenged, the way that measurement data is visualized, because again, it comes with a certain bias that one brings to the table. But then there are broader conventions that, as you said, like the coordinates of Panjim are always going to be a certain way of representation that would seem unchanging, right? So if you want to challenge that, you are challenging a convention that has been in the works for 2000 years.
Yeah. In fact, now that I said in 1000 years, maybe that long is also not accurate, because we are shifting, we are expanding as there's water levels rising. So yeah, even that is changing. Yeah, get it.
Right. Or it would have evolved in such a manner, say 1000 years from now, technology would have evolved in such a manner that if you looked at the map 1000 years from now of Panjim and the same map that is produced today, they might look like two different maps altogether. It is because we are evolving all the time. It also requires a certain element of visual literacy. We read maps because, there's an element of conditioning that allows us to read maps in a certain way. But 1000 years into the future, we might not be able to even read those maps. It might be so complex.
Very fascinating. Very. I just I'm losing chain of thought, but how are these designed? If I want, the earlier question which I mentioned about a bit technical key, who's a cartographer, or if I know you're not but if you can just give some, because you are a designer, can sort of how are these designed? Are you placing something? Are you putting it out as print work? Are you sort of putting it in the cloud? Is it just put up on a Goa museum? How are you sort of, because you're creating, and then how are you translating or communicating?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So actually that is a question we grappled with. Is we said, okay, we want to make maps. Then we said, we are architects and industrial designers. How do we get to make maps? It's not so easy for someone to just go and start drawing maps, because there's so much of work that's already been done. Where do you begin? So what we began doing, and what I began doing specifically, was collaborating with other map makers that exist across the country. And they're very specialized map makers, people who concentrate specifically on topography, on urban mapping, etc. So what we did was, I got together a group of architects, and we began talking to all these people across the country, exchanging data, and then overlaying these data sets and trying to reach a certain consensus of what is the story we're trying to get at. And so we reached out to this topographer who makes these very detailed topographic maps of the country. And then we asked him, okay, you zoom into this area. Then we looked into military maps. Okay. And military maps frequently look at data sets that impede the military. So rivers that need to be crossed, etc., are depicted pretty accurately in military maps. So we took that topographical data, we overlaid it with this military data. And then what we started getting is the terrain of Goa looking very different from what the government data kind of wants you to look at. The terrain. We started seeing the mining industry having a devastating impact on Goa's physical landscape, because much like the Konkan coast, there is not very large elevations in the terrain. So whenever you have like mining in Goa, basically start flattening out hills. When you start flattening out hills, it's the watershed that leads into the rivers that also get flattened out. So the health of the rivers also deteriorate. But that starts revealing itself when you talk to various map makers and then bring all their data sets together. A story, a pattern starts revealing itself. So yeah, so there is this angle, this political angle that we try to get at. But there's also these data sets we play with.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, but you said it aloud, is that if you're like a documentary filmmaker or a journalist, typically you don't start with an agenda. You just like purely document for the document's sake, and then sort of have an opinion or infer something from it, but not really start by challenging something. I mean, that will like really spoil the whole design of it. And then, how do you sort of put this out for consumption? Like, is it just on sort of the digital medium that we are in, or is it also helping certain other bodies to take certain calls? Like I know for the coastal road, Ayaz and Sameep have been sort of like working towards it, and then working with the local bodies to sort of the influence or at least educate, right? So like if you can just give like a bit of Goa Collective, how is it helping other sort of people in the system?
So one of my personal projects is working with this village of Chimbal. And what I've done is I wanted to also demonstrate the power of maps. And so I was documenting an archaeological site. And, Goa has so many archaeological sites, but many times they're not acknowledged by the government. Because why add another archaeological site when you do not have the money to maintain the ones already protected? So just ignore it, right?
In fact, so, I would say there is money. It's just that why to spend there? It's sort of.
So I would say one of the tricks I employed, knowing the power of Google Maps, was I told 50 of my friends, like over a period of 6 months, this archaeological site exists, and I sent them a photo on WhatsApp with the location pin. Kindly visit that site. And I have uploaded the photo of that site and dropped a pin in Google Earth. And I put a small description. And I said, just go to the site, let Google Maps record that you've been to the site, and leave a review of the site. That's it. Okay? The government doesn't want to acknowledge this site. You go and acknowledge it. So, like say 50 of my friends went over 6 months and started posting photos on Google Maps, etc. And that whole thing went viral. Like people in the village didn't know it existed. And then they got to know, like tourists, like foreign tourists, etc., started like coming to that site in the middle of Chimbal village, which is in the middle of like nowhere, and visiting the site and totally impressed. And then the whole like village got together and started putting a lot of pressure on the government. And they finally declared it a protected site. So that's the power of Google Maps. Yeah, so there's a lot of work that can be done, specifically with people with a graphic design background or architectural background. These are the tools of future, map making. And we're quite, like if we want to be like socially engaged, it's a wonderful way of like engaging with society.
Yeah. Amazing. Any other site that or any other work that you would like to share, which has sort of impacted or brought attention to the government or any of that matter, like any NGO got noticed it? And
yeah, so what I'm working on now is mapping an informal settlement, which is like, I don't like to use the word slum, but a squatter settlement in the village of Shimbal, which has been ignored for a very long time. And Goan society has this problem that we just like to ignore urban growth and then push people to, specifically from disadvantaged backgrounds, to the boundary. And then you've seen like this huge growth of these informal settlements on the boundaries of our cities. And it's leading to the deterioration of the cities, because you can't have a good part of a city and a bad part of a city. And we are all part of one urban landscape in Panjim. So one of the things I am doing with my students at the Goa College of Architecture is sending them there. Is first acknowledge that that place exists. Let's put it on a map. Let's map these houses. Let's show that human beings live in slums. Let's show that they are also politically marginalized and the densities they live in inhumane. Okay, and the same densities that exist in your neighborhoods with gated complexes and trees, etc. That kind of density should be made available to all citizens of Belgium. So what we're trying to do is get into these neighborhoods, gain the trust of the neighborhood, and then bring forward problems of urban congestion, the lack of a sewerage system, too many human beings living too close to each other, which leads to all sorts of epidemics and disease outbreaks because you're packing so many people so close together. Where is all that sewage going? Is it causing skin problems? Is it causing waterborne diseases? If it causes waterborne diseases, can you live in Panjim and say that I am completely immune to what's happening in Chimbel? You can't. So we are working on this project, and I frequently encourage my students to go there and then build up upon the data that previous students have built. And people are very thankful because then they can take that and ask the government, okay, provide us a sewerage line, etc. So yeah.
A common friend whom I've also interviewed, Ayaz Basrai, I think he put it nicely that these conversations are just expanding my mind. Like it's like design is a different meaning altogether in this context.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And this is, and ever since I've got into this field of map making, it just expands your social boundaries because architects talk to architects and interior designers talk to interior designers. Once you start engaging with social groups and civil society, you realize how diverse society is and that your friends groups, then your social circle also improves. It expands. You have so many more conversations to make.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool. I think I'm I would like to meet you in person definitely and have longer conversation. But just to conclude this episode, obviously in the given sort of time we have, we are talking about like you slightly moved the needle with Google Maps, which is a step towards the future and technology. So have you given some thought about what's the future of maps especially in the metaverse and in the digital world that we are entering? I've heard some, I can call horror stories that people are just sitting in like with their Oculus sets and living the world almost in like the digital, in the metaverse and don't know what's happening around. So yeah, it's tough, but have you given some thought about it? 100 years out, 50 years out?
Yeah, the way technology is expanding.
Yeah, what's going to happen to maps?
What's going to happen to maps, the way the world is going to be simplified for you is also quite dangerous because, we're going down this path of like having all this data available, but it's being simplified to an extent that it's becoming too easy to digest at times. So we're living in this kind of post-truth world where, data exists, but it's simplified and dumbed down so much that people can be misled, right? You've seen that in America. You've seen that in other democratic countries. It's like who've had a very strong democratic tradition, but you're constantly being fed with this data and visuals and graphs and the scaremongering. So there's always a positive side of technology, that measurements are increasing, data analysis, that's all being that's really advancing. But you're also having this negative side that it's being weaponized. So it's a challenging time to be in. And it requires a lot more engagement with the subject, I would feel, in conversations like this, speaking about map making, etc.
Yeah. Also, it needs a lot of purification because I was listening to another sort of spiritual podcast where he said it's a cliche line, with great power comes great responsibility, but it's sort of very important to utilize the power in the right direction. And unless
Absolutely.
you're not inherently pure, it's going to be catastrophic because it's very, very powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it can be weaponized also.
Yeah.
And now it's giving the individual the ability to weaponize all this data.
Yeah.
Like you have all this data that's going to be available to you. How do you use it responsibly?
Mhm.
Right. You can also like go down like a very catastrophic path.
Yeah. I've been poking around like the metaverse, and there are these decentral land and like whatever the metaverse may they have created maps and people are blocking lands and stuff, and it's
Yeah.
truly a democratic setup, but then there are no boundaries, so they're creating artificial boundaries so that there is some demand supply kind of a dynamic. Otherwise it's just like endless, it's an infinite world that is being created in the metaverse also. So yeah, I mean, that
Yeah.
would be very interesting to explore as well in the map setup itself.
Right.
Cool. I think this was wonderful. Thanks a lot for giving your time. Anything which I've missed, which you would like to share about map in general?
I would actually just like to make an appeal, actually, more than anything else,
Please.
is to people who follow the Goa Collective. And if you ever want to collaborate or ask us for any data or discuss any ideas, please feel free to reach out. And we are like totally open source, and we'll tell you how we make maps, what are the biases we bring to the table, and we can have a free-flowing discussion. We've reached out already to a small group of map makers across the country, and it's an absolutely wonderful conversation we're having. And we'd like more people to jump into this bandwagon and make more interesting maps, because in a democratic society, we require this. We require more maps coming out, more terrain being contested.
Correct. Yeah, and I'll add show notes, I'll link all the show notes. And for that, you can visit audiogyan.com also. I hardly make a plug. But okay, thanks a lot, Fernando, for this. It was really wonderful talking to you. And all the best. And hopefully we catch up in person soon. And
yes,
you can sort of teach me some tidbits of like map making also.
Thank you so much for having me on your talk. I really enjoyed this.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. For show notes and more Gyan, visit audiogyan.com. If you like this podcast, please don't forget to check our other interesting podcast on IVM Network. You can listen to us on IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. To stay tuned, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IVM Podcast. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at Audiogyan Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.
Habits? Routines? How exactly do they help us get better? Well, to simplify it for you, tune in to the Habit Coach podcast. I am Ashton Doctor, and I'm going to be here to help you get better daily with some simple, easy to do habits that you can easily adapt to your life. So tune in to the Habit Coach podcast from Monday to Friday, because I believe that awesome lives start with awesome habits.
We face 100 dilemmas every day while raising our children and nurturing our families. Why not let science help us make informed decisions to solve our dilemmas? Hi, I'm Devi Shobha.
And I'm Meghna. We host Big Talk About Tiny Humans, where we will help you unpack challenges around parenting and your child's development.
And more importantly, we will equip you with research-backed strategies that you can readily act on.
Tune in to our podcast every Wednesday on the IVM Podcasts app, website, or your favorite podcast platforms.